Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing a pretty important and big question that has been floating around the San Jose Sharks fan base over these past few weeks, ever since the hiring in Mike Grier, and since he's been pulling off these moves that some would call, including myself, somewhat questionable, I would say, and that is whether or not the 22-23 San Jose Sharks are tanking, whether or not they are purposely trying to lose games, if they have purposely made moves to make this team worse. And this is a pretty big deal because it has been a very long time since Sharks fans have even had to been faced with this question. It's been almost 2 decades of a very competitive San Jose Sharks team, so it was never really even a question whether or not the Sharks would be trying to go for it or not, and not even just going for it, but tanking is quite the opposite. You're going for it in the other direction. You're trying to get as close to the bottom of the standings as possible. The only year that was somewhat close would be the 14-15 season after the 2014 disappointment where the Sharks were reverse swept by the Los Angeles Kings. Doug Wilson used terminology like 1 step back to take 2 steps forward, or retooling, where the San Jose Sharks seemingly were slowing down a bit, but it didn't really feel as so much like a tanking type of season, even if the Sharks did miss the playoffs. And in these past 3 seasons where the Sharks were not competitive and did not make it to the playoffs, even then in the off seasons prior to those starts of the year, it never really felt as though the Sharks were trying to lose, right? The 18-19 offseason heading into the 19-20 season, the Sharks had just re-signed Erik Karlsson to an $11.5 million contract. A rebuilding team does not do that. In the 19-20 offseason heading into 2021, it felt as though that many of the Sharks brass were kind of hoping that the previous year was just a hiccup and a fluke, and that the Sharks were only bad because of maybe a set of injuries or bad luck, and Martin Jones would rebound and things like that. So even though they didn't really make many changes going into the 2021 season, I feel as though they still weren't trying to rebuild. And then just this past offseason, they signed Nick Bonino, they signed Andrew Cogliano, they completely changed up their goaltending tandem to bring in Adin Hill and James Reimer. So clearly the Sharks were hoping for some sort of improvement, even if it still didn't really happen. But this past offseason, like I said, or this current offseason, I should say, like I said, with the moves that Mike Grier has made, it really feels like we're kind of getting close to what a tanking team might look at. It's clearly not a full-on fire sale like the Chicago Blackhawks, where the question isn't even a question, it's just a statement. The Chicago Blackhawks are tanking. But with the Sharks, even if it's behind sort of veiled language, it very well might be the case, which is a bit strange because during the general manager search, it was pretty clear messaging from the very top of the Sharks organization, the ownership of the San Jose Sharks, that the Sharks were not looking for any sort of rebuild. This was why many of the more seasoned GM candidates may not have wanted to touch this particular role because they didn't necessarily feel like they may have had all of the freedom to make their own proper moves, and the Sharks were more so looking for someone who seemingly was going to fit into the "we're going for it" rubric. And yet with the hiring of Mike Grier, while that seemed to be the case early on with what he said, with the moves he's made, it kind of really brings up a different point, and this is exactly what I'm going to evaluate in this video. So I'm going to be talking about the additions of the players that the Sharks have added, as well as the subtractions, the players that the Sharks have gotten rid of this past offseason, and note whether or not the Sharks are generally better or worse for it and going into next season. And it's important to remember that there is no sort of high-profile free agent who left an unrestricted free agency. For instance, a few years ago when it was with the New York Islanders, it's kind of hard to say that the Islanders were trying to tank when John Tavares left because they didn't necessarily have a say in the matter. They tried to sign him, he just went to Toronto. So it's hard to say, oh, well, they're clearly tanking because they didn't sign Tavares. That's not here the case with the San Jose Sharks. There was no unrestricted, it's not as though Hertl was an unrestricted free agent at the end of this season and he walked to a completely different team, so the Sharks are obviously worse. All of these players could have been San Jose Sharks. The subtracted players could have been Sharks going into next season, and yet the Sharks made the choice themselves to get rid of them. So let's start off right at the top here with Brent Burns, the number 1 guy for the San Jose Sharks this past season. He led the entire league, not just the team, in terms of ice time, and now he is a Carolina Hurricane. This is a massive move that leaves a huge hole on the Sharks' back end, because while a few years ago, maybe 5-6 years ago, Brent Burns was just the number one offensive guy for the San Jose Sharks. He would come on when the Sharks were trailing by a goal or needed to score a goal on the power play. Meanwhile, in like a penalty kill situation or a tie game, you'd have the Marc-Edouard Vlasic Justin Braun pairing come in. Over these past few seasons where Vlasic has completely fallen off a cliff, in literally every possible situation, the San Jose Sharks would be sending on Brent Burns. It was like whoever was head coach, Peter DeBoer at first, then Bob Booner, didn't even have to consider the state that the game was in, didn't even have to take a look at any type of context clues for what exactly was going on. You know, like a scarecrow could have coached this team in particular just for when it comes to Brent Burns, because you just put him on the ice at every possible situation. Now that he's gone, that onus kind of falls onto Erik Karlsson. And while Karlsson did fit into that role a few years ago with the Ottawa Senators, he went the opposite direction of Brent Burns, where now he's more so the defenseman who you put on when you're trailing by a goal and you need a goal on the power play, but he's not the defenseman that you were putting on when you needed to protect a lead, or you were in a tie game very close, or you needed to kill a particular penalty. And yet with Brent Burns gone, he may need to step back into that role, and I don't know if Erik Karlsson is able to do that, because even in the situations last season where Brent Burns would be given a small rest, and Brent Burns would be benched at that point, just, you know, because he had just taken like a 2-minute shift or something along those lines, and so him and Ferraro would be on the bench. The Sharks would usually send out some combination of like Middleton and Vlasic, or Middleton and Megna. Erik Karlsson would rarely be the guy looked at. He had something like the 6th most penalty kill time on ice of all Sharks defensemen, even though he was second in terms of general time on ice for Sharks defensemen. So clearly he was not the reliable guy on the defensive side of things, and yet he may in fact have to be that now, and who's to say if he can do that? On top of that, Brent Burns was a player who could play every single game in a season. 82 games every single time. He had the second longest active Ironman streak in the league, only behind Phil Kessel. Erik Karlsson hasn't managed to string together a full 82-game season in forever, at least since he's been a San Jose Shark. And so if he's only going to end up playing 50 games next season, like he has basically been doing for all 3 years he's been with San Jose previously, how are the Sharks necessarily expected to, you know, do all that well if their number one guy is only playing about half the season? On top of that, with Burns gone, Karlsson has to move up the depth chart, but then everyone else behind him have to move up the depth chart as well. And so as your second pairing defenseman, your second right-handed defenseman behind Karlsson is now Ryan Merkley. And as much positives that I gave about Ryan Merkley this past season, is he ready to be a top 4 defenseman in the NHL? It's hard to say. It's possible that he can step into that role. Maybe David Quinn, new head coach, is going to be able to develop Merkley into like an Adam Fox type of player for the New York Rangers, but that doesn't necessarily seem super likely. And so generally the Sharks are very lacking in depth on the right-handed side, and even at the top level with Erik Karlsson, who's to say if he can actually fill in the massive shoes left by Brent Burns? But I should be moving on to these other players, because it wasn't just Brent Burns subtracted. We have Jonathan Dahlen, who wasn't given a qualifying offer too. He was a player who was able to play in the Sharks' top 6 at the beginning of last season, a couple of months where he was on that top line with Couture and Meyer. In particular, Couture even had that one quote that said like, "Oh, I specifically wanted to play with Jonathan Dahlen." Clearly that's not ending up still being the case if Couture had any say in things whatsoever. But Dahlen is now gone. So even though he kind of ended up falling off at the end of last season, that is still somewhat of a subtraction for the San Jose Sharks. There is also Rudolf Balcers. He was not just not given a qualifying offer, he was generally bought out on his $1.5 million contract, which doesn't necessarily seem like such a huge obstacle to work around, but for Mike Grier it seemingly was. Balcers was a player who was quite good in a third line role and could technically flex up to the second line if necessary, which is usually pretty good for a $1.5 million player. Once again, I will emphasize there, but whatever. And then finally, the most recent subtraction for the San Jose Sharks would be Sasha Chmelevski. He was given a qualifying offer, interestingly enough, and it seems as though maybe through negotiations it was pretty much made clear to Chmelevski that he would still be sort of a borderline guy, that maybe he would still get signed if he signs his qualifying offer, but he would have no guarantee of actually playing on the NHL roster, and so he seemingly made the choice instead to head to the KHL. I'm not super happy about it because, of course, Chmelevski in my lineup projection, even with all of these moves made to bolster the Sharks' depth, I still had Chmelevski as the 12th forward because I was so impressed with him at the end of last season, and now he's just gone. So that does suck. And then when we take a look at the addition side, is it necessarily all that better? Well, let's find out. First, we have Oscar Lindblom brought over from the Philadelphia Flyers. He was somewhat comparable, I would say, to Jonathan Dahlen, a player who was at one point capable of playing in the top six. He seemed on track to be a second liner, but through these past couple of years, that hasn't necessarily panned out for reasons outside of his control. And so generally going into the next season, it's technically possible that he can fill into a top six role, but it's more likely he ends up being a sort of third liner. And while I do think he can fit into that third line role better than what Dahlen could have, it should be noted that Lindblom would also have been making, almost double what Dahlen would have made if the Sharks had actually ended up signing him, maybe like slightly less than double what he made. So the Sharks are paying a bit of a premium for a player who's only maybe marginally better than what Dahlen could offer. And that is kind of a theme here with many of the additions the Sharks made. The same goes with Luke Kunin. He's a player who is also pretty good in the third line role, could technically flex up to the second line. The big difference is that the Sharks are paying him almost double of what they would have been paying Rudolf Balcers for a pretty similar style, skill level of player. Obviously, Kunin brings a bit more of a physical game. He's a bit more of a hard-bodied, hard-nosed type of player for the San Jose Sharks. It seems as though that's kind of the direction that Mike Grier was trying to take this team in. Maybe he viewed Dahlen and Balcers as players who just weren't giving it 100% shift in, shift out, and yet the players that they are picking up, like Kunin, like Sturm, are indeed players who are giving it their all every single time. But if we take a look at the more analytics side, the fancy stats side, I would have had more faith in Balcers flexing up to that second line compared to Luke Kunin, because Balcers' fancier stats were significantly better on a worse team, right? The Sharks were not as good as the team Luke Kunin was on, the Nashville Predators. The Predators weren't, significantly better, but they were noticeably better and had better underlying stats. So generally, the difference is not so great. When it comes to a couple of these other players, Nico Sturm was brought in 3 years, $2 million to basically be like a pretty good fourth liner. That much is definitely the case. The Sharks' fourth line last year was awful for much of the season, icing players like Gadjevich and Viel and Peterson, who should not even be in the NHL. So if there's one thing that is 100% certain, is that the Sharks' fourth line should be noticeably better going into the next season, and Nico Sturm is technically a part of that. But is he so wildly better than Chmelevski that he deserves double the money? That's kind of hard to say. Basically, Nico Sturm is essentially just a more established and more I know what I'm going to get type of player than Chmelevski would have been. But I would say Chmelevski had a slightly higher ceiling because I felt as though we saw more flashes from him. Meanwhile, Nico Sturm is much more established. Like I said, he's like 27 years old. What you see is what you're going to get. He's probably not going to get any noticeably better from what we've seen the past couple of years on teams like Minnesota and then at the end, Colorado. And then there is, of course, Steven Lorentz picked up in the Brent Burns trade. He is a player who was a fourth liner for the Carolina Hurricanes. The general theme here for the players the Sharks actually picked up this offseason. Lorentz, maybe he'll get some time there on the fourth line, especially with Chmelevski gone, but isn't necessarily going to move the needle. So when it comes to the forward side of things, if we were to completely discount Brent Burns, you could say that there was a slight improvement, I would say. It's rather marginal in my eyes, but I would say that the Sharks did definitely bolster their depth and would technically have been slightly better. It wouldn't have been enough to get the Sharks into the playoffs or anything like that, but I would have said that the Sharks were not tanking. But with the Brent Burns trade, that is the massive hole that there is to need to be filled. And what did the Sharks do to address that massive hole? Well, they signed Marcus Nudivara, who is a left-handed defenseman, played only a singular game with the Florida Panthers last season because he was injured for much of the year. So at best, maybe he comes in as like a second pairing defenseman for the San Jose Sharks to pair with Ryan Merkley. At worst, he ends up like as a seventh defenseman for the San Jose Sharks, I guess. And then there is Matt Benning, who signed for 4 years at $1.25 million, so he's clearly not viewed as some sort of savior of the right-handed side for the San Jose Sharks. He is likely to just be like a third-pairing defenseman, and if Merkley were to falter in front of him, maybe he can move up to that second pairing, but it wouldn't be a very good look for the San Jose Sharks if he did, because Matt Benning is not a very good defenseman at the NHL level. It's not to be mean to him, he just isn't. That's why he signed 1.25. You pay $1.25 million to a defenseman who you expect to be like your sixth, maybe even seventh defenseman. You don't pay it to your top four guy. And so generally, the Sharks, like I said, past Karlsson, there is a massive chasm that could maybe be filled by Ryan Merkley, but is otherwise going to be a huge issue for the San Jose Sharks. So to bring it back to the question, are the San Jose Sharks tanking, even if at the forward point the Sharks have maybe gotten somewhat better? The departure of Brent Burns and the complete lack of fill-in for him makes it pretty clear that the San Jose Sharks are going to be a worse team than next season. Now, this doesn't mean that the Sharks are going to do worse than they did. It just means that on paper they're looking worse, because we never know the general fluctuations of play. Maybe Eklund does amazing in that top six role and ends up elevating the Sharks' top six to farther past where they were this past season. Maybe Bordelot really emerges into a very, very good center and gets like 60 points next season. Maybe the Sharks' goaltending is even better than it was this past year. Maybe David Quinn unlocks the secret to this team. And so generally, it's possible that the Sharks are not only better from this past season, but they could theoretically in some, I can imagine a world where they do indeed make the playoffs, but on paper, based on the moves that the Sharks made, it seems as though this team wants to lose games. Class dismissed.